Good morning, everyone. We'll give it just a minute or so to let everybody join the webinar. All right, well, it looks like we still have a few individuals joining, but I am going to get started just with the introduction so that we're not wasting any time here. Again, welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning to learn about getting reading right. My name is Cory Brewer. My role here at Will is Education Counsel. So I'm one of our attorneys. I work in both litigation and on our policy team. And this presentation is part of our Restoring American Education initiative, which is an ongoing project of Will to kind of close a critical gap by engaging parents, school board members, and teachers with an understanding of kind of concerns, trends, and alternative resources that are available in K through 12 education. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Now, if anyone has questions as the presentation is ongoing, there is a Q&A function. So at any time, feel free to add a question in that function. I want to talk too about just our next presentation so that you all can save the date. So save August 6th. We will be having a virtual presentation on school safety. We're very lucky to be having national school safety expert Ryan Petty joining us, and more information about that will be coming out soon. But for now, please save the same time, 11 a.m. Central on August 6th to learn about school safety. And just in general, we encourage you to reach out to us to hear from you directly what kind of resources would be available to you. How can we be most helpful? And last, before I introduce our guest today, this is going to be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel. So if you miss anything, if you want to read it or watch it, I should say again later, it will be posted. Now, turning to Robert Pondiscio, he's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He focuses on K through 12 education, curriculum, teaching, school choice, charter schooling, and before joining AEI, Robert was at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is an education policy think tank. He previously worked for the Core Knowledge Foundation as an advisor and civics teacher at Democracy Prep Public Schools. Before that, he worked in journalism for 20 years, including in senior positions at Time and Business Week. Mr. Pondiscio is the author of many books. He's been extensively published in popular press, including in The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and he's a frequent speaker, often interviewed on radio and television like CNN, Fox News, and he has a master's degree in elementary education from Mercy College and a bachelor's in English from SUNY Empire State College. Now, we think this presentation in particular will be really helpful for any school board members out there who are currently selecting or will be selecting in the near future reading curricula. And that can be here in Wisconsin or anywhere else in the country. So here in Wisconsin, as many of you know, we have a new reading bill. So Wisconsin Act 20, known as the Right to Read Act, that became law last summer. It's currently in the process of being implemented. Specifically, the legislature initiated this early literacy effort to increase literacy proficiency between kindergarten and third grade. They want to focus on the science of reading, proof curriculum, and professional development for teachers. So Robert will discuss these topics more generally, but if anyone has questions specific to the Wisconsin law, they should feel free to reach out to us directly at Will. And as Robert will discuss, we need to be moving away from outdated practices and towards evidence-based approaches to help students learn to read. So one last thing before I turn it over. Phonics has been discussed extensively recently. but this is more than phonics. It's about more than phonics. And Robert's going to talk about reading comprehension, curriculum adoption and implementation, and changes needed to improve literacy outcomes. So with that, I will turn it over to our presenter for today, Mr. Robert Pondiscio.
Thank you, Cory, and thanks for having me. This is, I guess, a follow-up from our conversation that we had on stage at the School Board Summit a couple of months ago. And I think I more or less invited myself, saying, please invite me back to talk about content knowledge and literacy. So thank you for letting me invite myself today. Let's start with a game. When I present this information to teachers, I like to play this game. So I'm going to tap out the rhythm of a famous song. I'm not going to try to fool you. It's a famous song, an easy song. I'm not going to sing it. I'm not going to hum it. I'm just going to tap out the notes. Your job is to listen to the taps and identify this song. And again, a song that everybody knows. Here we go. See if you can do it. Okay, now that's maybe a little bit tricky, but I'm sure you recognize that song. That's "God Bless America," right? You all got that. But now that you know how this game works, I'll give you an even simpler song, because that was harder than you think. But let's try an even simpler song. Here we go. Ready? Okay. I will confess, I'm having a little joke at your expense. I really don't expect you to recognize that as "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star" or the ABC song. But I like to do this demonstration because this is 30 years ago or so. There was a Stanford graduate student by the name of Elizabeth Newton. She did her dissertation in psychology on that very game. And she discovered something remarkable. Given a list of 25 well-known songs to tap out, the listener's success rate was only 2.5%, about one out of 40 attempts. But that was not what I found interesting about this research. As part of this experiment, she asked the person tapping out the song to predict whether or not the listener would guess correctly. So the tappers were so sure that the listener would know the song that they predicted a 50% success rate, one out of two. So why that disconnect? Why is this game so hard? We know these songs so well. Well, in this game, the tapper, me, I hear the song in my mind. I think it's so obvious that you, the listener, can't possibly fail to know it. That I know the words, I hear the melody to "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star" or "God Bless America." And what do you hear? Tap, 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 tap. So the tapper, me, can't understand why the listener, you, doesn't get it. The listener can't understand why the tapper thinks he or she should. So what makes this so hard is that the person tapping out the song has been given knowledge, the song title, that makes it impossible for them to imagine what it's like to lack that knowledge. So when they're tapping, they can no longer imagine what it's like for the listener to hear isolated taps rather than a song. This is the curse of knowledge. And what I mean by that is once we know something, it's almost impossible to imagine what it's like not to know it anymore. It all seems so obvious to us that we assume everyone else knows what we know. Our knowledge has cursed us, so to speak. So as a listener, the game is hard because even though you're getting valid information, it's incomplete information. You're not getting the whole song. You try to fill in the gaps, but it's hard. You don't know what the other person knows. The reason I like this experiment and the reason I like talking about it is it's as good a model as you're ever going to find as to why background knowledge is the key to reading comprehension. Because just like in that game, writers make assumptions about readers' knowledge, and usually it works. But for struggling readers, like many of the kids in our school, what's on the page is useful, but it's not enough. It's incomplete. It's that curse of knowledge. So I'd like to address a couple of different facets of this this morning. I want to discuss why knowledge matters, why reading is not a skill, why there's really no such thing as a reading test. And mostly, I want to talk about some general misconceptions that we have about language proficiency and reading, and how those misconceptions affect how we teach and test reading, and how the very worst thing that we can do is to, say, narrow curriculum, jettison science and history and art and music. And paradoxically, if we do jettison those things to make more time for reading, we'll probably make things worse, not better. So I hope to convince you that without attending to what children learn, to curriculum, that our concerns about reading achievement will continue to go from, say, an acute to a chronic condition, but they will never go away. And as Cory alluded to up top, this is hugely important, even especially for those of us who think of ourselves as advocates for the science of reading, which I can't emphasize this strongly enough. That's more than just phonics. But let me begin by contextualizing this for you, tell you a little bit about my own journey as a teacher. So up until about 20 years ago, I had a very life in the warm bosom of corporate America. I ran the public affairs department at Time Magazine and then later at Business Week. I had a nice office, a nicer expense account. It was indoor work, no heavy lifting. It was not bad. And then I was seduced one day by an ad on the New York City subway system. It was this very ad. This is for a program called the New York City Teaching Fellows, which is an alternative certification program for mid-career switchers. And the poster said, "You remember your first grade teacher's name, who will remember yours?" And I was instantly hooked. I was ready to single-handedly close the achievement gap by myself. So fast forward a few months, and this is what my life now looked like. Um, that building is PS 277 in the South Bronx. Now the New York City school system is mammoth. It's the largest school system in the country, but it's divided into about 3 dozen community school districts. So the South Bronx is Community School District 7. District 7 was at that time and still is the lowest scoring district in New York City. The building that you're looking at, PS 277, was the lowest scoring school in District 7. So in June, I left my nice, cushy office job. And come September, I'm teaching in a school that was literally, by definition, the worst of the worst, the lowest of the low. So what does that look like? Well, it's the test scores in my school, my first year in the classroom in 2002, showed that 16% of the previous year's fourth graders, the students who are now in my classroom, were at or above grade level in reading. So to put that in another way, that meant that more than 4 out of 5 of the children in my classroom had failed the previous spring's New York State reading test, which is obviously appalling. Now, we're having rarely set foot in a elementary school classroom since I was 10 years old myself. I assumed as a novice that my classroom would be filled with kids who couldn't read, that they would be literally hard pressed to turn letters into words, words into sentences. To use a word that I did not know at the time, I assumed my students would be unable to do this, to decode. And when we say phonics, it's decoding. Um, but that's not what I found. So I taught a PS 277 for 5 years. Again, lowest of the low in the heart of the very is pretty common. Every teacher of struggling readers has heard of. I mean, again, sure, there are some number of kids who struggle with decoding, but there are far, far more who read it but don't get it. So why? Why don't they get it? Well, when I became a teacher, I learned another word that I'd never heard before, which is metacognition. And that means thinking about thinking. I was taught and trained to believe that the reason my students read it but didn't get it was because they were not very good at thinking about their thinking while they were reading. They were not sufficiently trained and practiced in what you see in front of you right now, these so-called metacognitive reading strategies. In other words, when good readers read, supposedly they question the author, they think about their purpose in reading. They make text-to-self connections and text-to-world connections and text-to-text connections. The idea, at least what I was told, is that if kids learn to connect unfamiliar words and ideas to familiar words and ideas, then they can make sense of just about anything that they read. At least, again, that's how I was trained. I remember thinking, as a nearly 40-year-old mid-career switcher, well, that's kind of strange. When I'm reading, I'm not thinking about my thinking. I'm thinking about what I'm reading. It didn't resemble how I remembered learning to read. But if I'm being honest, I don't remember having any explicit reading instruction after, say, first grade. But I figured, look, what do I know? It's been 30 years since I've been in elementary school. But then there was the undeniable fact of those lousy test scores. And in my grad school classes, I would ask about all these reading strategies that we were practicing with our students. And I remember asking, look, if my students are struggling to understand simple texts, aren't they also going to struggle knowing which of these strategies to use or to remember to use them at all? Um, and how can a child follow the general thrust of a book when we force them or ask them to stop every few seconds to write down all those metacognitive visualizations and observations and predictions on a post-it note and stick them in their books? If you've ever been in an elementary school classroom, if you look at the books that the kids are reading while mastering these skills and strategies, their books look like unmade beds, just a Niagara of post-it notes. To make a long story short, I just got to be a little bit curious about the way that I was taught to teach reading comprehension to struggling readers in my South Bronx elementary school. It just didn't make sense. So eventually I discovered the work of a guy named E.D. Hirsch Jr. of core knowledge fame, who had written articles and books about background knowledge and reading and language and vocabulary, and how a lack of common shared knowledge makes it difficult for kids, especially low-income kids like my students, to understand even simple texts. I learned a lot from reading Hirsch and others about language growth and vocabulary and reading comprehension, and it all made perfect sense to me. I mean, Hirsch was the one theorist, I've said this 1,000 times, who was perfectly describing what I was seeing in my South Bronx classroom every day. My students rarely had a day of, with history or geography. They had no art or music, very little science instruction. They knew nearly nothing about life beyond 149th Street in Mott Haven, South Bronx. I remember that one day, one of my brightest, most capable students, I realized that she was under the impression that New Jersey was a different country, and she was not being sarcastic. She meant it. She had no concept that New Jersey was part of the United States. So what were we doing to remediate this lack of common knowledge? Nothing. We weren't concerned about it at all. In fact, I wish I had $1 for every person I heard back in those days say some version of, oh, sure, history and science, all that other stuff, that's important, but first we have to make sure kids know how to read. Well, it doesn't work that way. Unless kids have broad background knowledge, they will never be strong readers. They can't. So let's talk about reading, how we teach it, how we test it. And understanding this is critical, especially for those of us in education who bear the burden of improving the outcomes for low income and disadvantaged kids. So if you take only 5 words from my talk today, please make it these 5. Reading is not a skill. I grant you that is a counterintuitive statement, because if you think about your own reading ability, if you think about it at all, you probably think of it like riding a bike. Reading is an ability that you acquire as a child and generally never lose. If you know how to ride a bike, well, then you can ride any bike, right? It's the same thing with reading, right? Some of us may read faster or slower, but when you think about your ability to read, you probably perceive it as not just a skill, but a transferable skill. In other words, once you learn how to read, you can read anything: a novel, a newspaper article, a memo from the boss, a college course syllabus. Reading is reading is reading. Either you can do it or you can't. Well, that view of reading is partially correct. As I mentioned before, the ability to translate symbols into sound, decoding, that is a skill, and that is a transferable skill, and I can demonstrate that to you. So here are 5 nonsense words, just flat made up. I'm going to read them out loud, and as I do so, listen to how I pronounce them, and just notice if you disagree with any of my pronunciations. So number 1 is rigfap. Number 2 is churbit. Number 3, napsate. Number 4, pagbo. Number 5, plizzle. If I put an E at the end of churbit, it becomes what? Churbite. I'm guessing that nobody disagrees with any of those pronunciations. And the reason we're able to read and agree on the pronunciations of made-up words is because excellent decoders. We've internalized the pronunciation of our language. We've mastered the code. The chances are also pretty good that you've mastered and internalized language structure. Here is the first sentence of a familiar poem. It is Lewis Carroll's poem Jabberwocky. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe." So if you look at the sentence carefully, I'm guessing you will agree. If I asked you what were the nouns in this sentence, you would say, well, brillig, it was brillig, toves, and wabe. What part of speech are gyre and gimble? Well, they're verbs. So we're so talented with decoding and language structure that not only can you read nonsense words, but you can even identify the parts of speech on sight when they're used in a sentence. So decoding, language structure, these are transferable skills, we can all agree. But reading isn't about decoding, is it? It's about understanding the words, what the words mean. It's about comprehension, and comprehension is not a transferable skill. And here's simple proof of that. The sentence reads, "Trout hit into a 6-4-3 double play to end the game." Now, some of you have no idea what this means. But if you're a baseball fan and you read the sentence, it has a lot of information in it. You immediately understand that the Los Angeles Angels lost a game, a baseball game, when Mike Trout came up to bat with a man on first and one out, probably in the ninth inning. He hit a ground ball to shortstop, who threw to the second baseman, who relayed to first in time to catch Trout for the final out. Game over. Some of you are scratching your head right now saying, what? It says that? If you've never heard of Mike Trout or a 6-4-3 double play, if you can't reconstruct the game situation, you did not just become a poor reader. You just lack the domain-specific knowledge of baseball that allows you to fill in those gaps. Yeah, there's my picture of the Angels. Here's a cultural literacy cartoon for you. Interestingly, you don't have to have read The Scarlet Letter to get this joke, but you do at least have to be familiar. You had to have heard of The Scarlet Letter and probably the main character, Hester Prynne. If you don't, the joke just falls flat. Here's another one. Awful lot going on in this cartoon, right? In order to unpack the multiple levels of background knowledge, you need a fair amount of background knowledge and familiarity with literary references. Obviously, Goodnight Moon, to make this cartoon work. Here's one more. There is an astonishing amount of prior knowledge and vocabulary needed to make sense of this fairly simple joke. But critically, and this is the main point, the speaker, Groucho Marx in this case, is making an assumption. He's assuming that you have the vocabulary and background knowledge to fill in the gaps. The joke loses its punch if he or somebody else has to explain all of these things. What is an insomniac, an agnostic, a dyslexic, etc. So remember that curse of knowledge game that I started with. Again, writers assume that readers know things. When they don't, meaning breaks down. One of the hardest things, however, for educated people to wrap their heads around, just like in that curse of knowledge game, is just how easily and fluidly you fill in the gaps when you're reading. I'm going to give you an example of how hard it can be to make meaning when knowledge is missing. Here's a one paragraph reading passage. I'm going to give you about 45 seconds just to read this to yourself. It is a bit awkward and strange, this passage, I grant you. More seconds. Okay, so this reading passage was part of an experiment in reading recall. Some people in the experiment who read this paragraph had a very hard time answering questions shortly after they read it. The way the experiment worked was people were given this passage to read, 20 minutes later, they had to answer questions to test their reading recall. So half of the people in the study did quite well, and half of them did quite poorly. The people who did well, however, had a little extra help that made it a little bit easier to understand and recall, and it was this. See, the difficulty with this passage has nothing to do with text complexity or reading level. Each sentence in the passage by itself is pretty simple. The difficulty comes in trying to connect the sentences into a coherent narrative, into a story. But the people in the experiment who were told it was about washing clothes had a higher recall. It's because they had a mental model of what they were reading that helped them make sense of it. Having the title gave them the context, if you like, that made the passage a little bit stickier, so they were able to answer questions 20 minutes later. So the moral of the story is that context matters. But unfortunately, when we're teaching children how to read, too often we teach decoding, then we teach those reading strategies. What we're not teaching is context. So when you narrow curriculum, when you take out literature and science and history and art and music and the full rich knowledge that literate Americans take for granted, you're basically failing to teach context. And without context, too often children only have a vague understanding of what they're reading. They read it, but they don't get it. So reading comprehension, I hope this shows, making meaning out of text. Well, that's not an all-purpose how-to skill that you can practice, learn, and master. It's a function of background knowledge. It's a function of vocabulary. Yes, obviously, you need to be able to decode. You need to know all or most of the words, but you also need some background knowledge to make meaning. But here's the thing. The way we teach reading in elementary schools assumes that reading comprehension is also a transferable skill, that all those references and facts, well, that's just stuff that you can look up. I mean, if you think about it, what is it about knowledge? Why do so many of our schools to this day downplay its importance? Think of the things that you hear about education, and maybe if you're honest, maybe you've said some of these things yourself. Mere facts aren't important. We should stress critical thinking. The goal of education is to learn how to learn. Let's teach students to think. You can always look up information. Or this one. It doesn't make sense to focus on knowledge in the era of Google. These are some of my favorite homilies in education. I call them homilies because we don't think about them. We just recite them. And they sound so sensible. I mean, you really can just look things up, right? Can't you? Well, not really. The default mode of reading instruction in our schools across the country, broadly speaking, is learn how to decode, practice reading strategies, and then you can read anything. If you're a good reader, you can make sense of any text as long as you understand all or nearly all of the words. Well, let's put that to the test. Does it work? Let's see if reading strategies can help us make sense of a challenging piece of text. This is a passage that Edie Hirsch Jr. Culled from a newspaper, the sports section. Again, take a few seconds and read this passage to yourself. Okay, so let's attack this reading passage the way we teach elementary school students to attack a challenging, unfamiliar piece of text. Okay, we'll use our reading strategies. So let's determine the author's purpose. That's one of the reading strategies we teach kids. Well, this is clearly an account of a cricket match, since he's talking about wickets. The author is trying to tell us about what happened in a game played by, I guess, the Australian cricket team. Is this helping your comprehension yet? No? Okay, visualization, that's an important reading strategy. I put a picture up there of a cricket match to help you visualize what that looks like. Maybe it will help if I make a text-to-world connection. Let's connect the unfamiliar information in the passage in your mind to something you already know. Well, I know baseball, cricket is like baseball. They're both played with balls and bats. Is that helping? Maybe there's another reading strategy that we can use. This is my favorite one. Question the author. Does anybody have a question for the author? Well, I have a question for the author. It's, what the hell are you talking about? I know all the words. I'm sure you do as well. I understand the broad context. I'm reasonably well educated. You could apply reading strategies until the sun goes out, and you're not going to make sense of this because you don't know cricket. And if you do know cricket, then you made easy sense of this. So you lack the content knowledge to make sense of this. By the way, you can test this tonight at home. Try reading a new product warranty or instructions, say, for installing the operating system on your computer if you're not technologically oriented. You'll have the same result. You'll feel your rate of reading slow down. You will read and reread, trying to make sense. You might even trace it with your finger. You might even feel your lips moving when you're reading something out of your depth. Um, it's not that you became a bad reader. It's you're reading in an unfamiliar domain. Um, Even simple text, by the way, expect readers to fill in gaps. The writers and speakers always assume that you have the background knowledge to do so. So if you look at this example, familiar words, what we would call tier one vocabulary, the kind of words that kids come to school knowing, even those simple words can be confusing in an unfamiliar context. So the word shot, for example, means something very different in a doctor's office, on the basketball court, on a rifle range, or if the repairman tells you that your washing machine is shot. Um, the word fall changes context in this cartoon. Um, the bottom line is that decoding is a transferable skill. Reading comprehension depends on vocabulary, shared or assumed knowledge. You can't make reading comprehension into a transferable skill, no matter how hard you try. But reading tests, the tests by which we evaluate schools, teachers, and districts, it assumes that reading is a broad how-to skill that is easily measured and assessed, and that background knowledge either doesn't matter or that it's evenly distributed among all children. And look, there's no mystery, right? Why affluent children are better readers. They come to school on day one with more background knowledge and bigger vocabularies. They're more likely to travel, visit museums, have rich dinner table conversations with mom and dad. Many of the kids that I taught back in the day in the South Bronx are what I would consider school-dependent learners. In other words, if they don't learn it at school, too often they don't learn it at all. So what do? We take kids who show up at school already behind, and then we go out of our way to make sure that they don't get the most important thing they need to close those language gaps. Content, deep, rich, broad knowledge about the world in which they live. I just cannot overstate how critical this is for disadvantaged children, for low-income kids, like my struggling readers back then in the South Bronx. There's even a name for this phenomenon. It's called the Matthew effect. So the term the Matthew effect, I think it was coined by Keith Stanovich, a cognitive scientist at the University of Toronto. It has been used to describe what happens when some kids come to school with smaller vocabulary and less general knowledge than their peers. The name comes from this Bible passage in the Gospel of Matthew, for unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. In plain English, this means obviously the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. So when it comes to language and vocabulary, that Matthew effect means that those who are language poor in early childhood tend to grow poorer and fall further behind, while those who are verbally rich get richer. Why? Well, because knowledge builds on knowledge, language builds on language, words build on words. Think about how you learn new words. It's not by studying vocabulary. We all memorize word lists for the SATs, but that's not why we have big vocabularies. A typical college freshman has a working vocabulary of about 60,000 words. Well, do that math in your head. To learn 60,000 words by age 18, you'd need to learn 10 words a day, 70 words per week, 3,300 words a year. And that, by the way, is assuming you learn your first 10 in the delivery room. And 10 more every day until freshman year. So obviously we don't memorize, our way to a big vocabulary. So where does all that language growth come from? Well, the more words you know, the faster you acquire new words. The rich get richer. You acquire new words indirectly in context, in everyday usage. Here's a word that some of you may know, but I suspect most will not. Because we are all good decoders, we can read this word. It's excrescence. But you know what it means. Maybe it would help if I gave it to you in a sentence. So here's the word excrescence in a sentence. To calculate fuel efficiency, the aerospace engineers needed an accurate estimation of excrescence drag caused by the shape of a plane's cabin. That might not be that helpful. So here's another sentence. Excrescences on the valve of the heart have been known to cause strokes. Um, so perhaps now you're developing a vague understanding of the word. If I give you another sentence, you can test that understanding or that guess and maybe refine your definition. A wart, a small excrescence on his skin, had made Jeremy self-conscious for years. So by now, I think you probably have a pretty solid understanding of the word. One more sentence should verify that understanding. So at the far end of the meadow was what at first glance I thought was a huge dome building and then saw was an excrescence from the cliff itself. So this demonstration was created by a former colleague of mine at the Core Knowledge Foundation, Alice Wiggins, um, to show how language growth occurs. And you probably figured out by now, if you didn't already know, that the word excrescence means a projection or outgrowth, especially an abnormal one. I think about the dictionary definition. There you go. Something that bulges out or is protuberant. So the reason I'm showing you this word is this is an accelerated example of how word learning occurs and of the Matthew effect. So the general sense of a word that a listener or reader gains by experiencing the actual uses of the word in the wild, it's not fixed, it's not definite, it's a general meaning, possibilities and probabilities that get narrowed down with each through each exposure and through context every time you encounter that new word. And this is how most of the word meanings are acquired indirectly. But, and here's the important point, think of all the words and knowledge that you already had that enabled you to learn that new word, excrescence. You know about engineers and strokes and warts. You didn't have to stop and wonder what the words fuel efficiency and aerospace meant, what it means to feel self-conscious. You are already rich in knowledge and vocabulary, and you just got a little bit richer. If you didn't know those things, you just fell a little bit further behind. We all learned a new word that you did not. That's the Matthew effect. I didn't take time to explain about aerospace engineers, how the heart works, what meadows and cliffs are. I just assumed that you knew the general gist of what I was talking about, that there was one unfamiliar word or concept in there, excrescence. So the gist, that's the secret sauce. The gist is where the magic of language growth occurs. If you don't get the gist of what I'm talking about or what you're reading about, your understanding is vague. Your ability to learn new words, to grow your vocabulary, to gain new knowledge is vague. This is profoundly important, and it gets to the heart of our struggle to improve reading comprehension. If we don't teach kids, especially disadvantaged kids, science, history, geography, art, music, all of it, if we don't make their education as rich and robust as possible, that dreaded Matthew effect takes hold and it doesn't let go. Word growth slows. They're not going to learn how to read with understanding. They will read it, but they will not get it. So Dan Willingham, a friend, a brilliant cognitive scientist from the University of Virginia, puts it simply. He says, teaching content is teaching reading. And there's, by the way, a 10-minute YouTube video with that exact title that Dan put on YouTube years ago called Teaching Content is Teaching Reading. I strongly urge you to check that out later on today. So why is teaching content like teaching reading? Well, reading is what a cognitive scientist like Dan would call domain specific. You have to know a little bit about the subject and sometimes a lot about the subject to understand what you're reading about it. The same thing, by the way, is also true of creativity, critical thinking, problem solving. All of our most cherished goals for schooling are knowledge dependent. But how many times have you heard it said that we're going to get away from teaching mere facts and teach skills like creativity, critical thinking, and problem solving? Well, it doesn't work that way. There was a paper some years ago with the title, "Could Steven Spielberg manage the Yankees?" The answer is no, or at least probably not. He's a creative genius, but his expertise is in filmmaking. There's no reason to think he'd be any more successful out of his depth than you or I would be managing the Yankees in the Bronx. So there's no such thing as an all-purpose genius or critical thinker. Those skills, like reading comprehension, are domain specific. They don't transfer from one knowledge domain to the other, and neither does reading comprehension. I'll give you one last experiment just to hammer the point home. This is the when I used to talk about this years ago, nobody had heard of this, but now thanks to people like Emily Hanford, Natalie Wexler, others are more familiar with this middle school, the so-called baseball experiment. So there was a study several years ago. It looked at junior high school students. From memory, I believe it was seventh graders who were either good readers or poor readers based on standardized test scores. So that you've got two groups. You've got, half of the study subjects are good readers, half are poor readers based on standardized test scores. And then within those two groups, half of them know a lot about baseball, half of them know very little. So now if you think about it, there's four different groups of students. Good readers who know baseball, good readers who do not know baseball, poor readers who know baseball, poor readers who know nothing about baseball. So in the experiment, the researchers asked the kids to read about an inning of a baseball game, a reading passage about a baseball game, and they would stop them as they were reading and ask them to move model figures around the board to demonstrate what was happening, to illustrate the action. So think carefully about this. If reading comprehension was a transferable skill that could be taught, practiced, and mastered the way we teach it, the way we test it, then the students who are good readers should have no trouble outperforming the poor readers, right? Either you are a good reader or you're not. And once you become a good reader, you're always going to be a good reader, no matter what, right? So what did this experiment show? Well, this was the thing. Good readers who did not know about the game of baseball got an average of 18.8 items out of 40 correct. The ostensible poor readers who didn't know baseball got 27 out of 40 correct. So to say it differently, poor readers with high content knowledge outperformed good readers with low content knowledge. To put it in a different way, knowing a lot about the subject made the poor readers into good readers. So if this makes you question who is a good reader and who is a bad reader, well, that's exactly the point. Who's more likely to get a good score on a reading test? Is it the kid who spent the most time practicing those reading strategies, or is it the kid with the broadest base of general knowledge? Visit an elementary school where struggling fourth or fifth graders are learning to read, and you'll almost certainly see these ubiquitous posters, all around the classroom. Good readers ask questions. Good readers create pictures in their minds. Good readers make connections when they read. You'll also see teachers, earnestly doing their best, trying to do think alouds. That's a technique you learn as a teacher where you read out loud to your students and you interrupt yourself to ask yourself questions. What they're doing is modeling, as we say, the habits of good readers. They're showing students what good readers do, encouraging their students to imitate and adopt those good reading behaviors. Well, my point quite simply is it's not enough to teach children what good readers do. We must also teach them what good readers know. So look, reading strategies, I want to be clear, have some benefit. Mostly they teach kids that a text is supposed to make sense. But strategy instruction is not enough to guarantee comprehension. There's also no evidence that repeated practice of strategies ensures comprehension. I think 10 lessons, for example, works as well as 50. So as I like to say, in the end, reading is not a skill that you teach, it's a condition you create. And you create that condition not by practicing and mastering reading strategies, but by ensuring our most disadvantaged kids get all the science and history and geography and art and music possible. If you cut those things to make time for more reading practice, you're doing it wrong, frankly. The bottom line is that knowledge is literacy. The example I love to use is think of a reading passage as something like a game of Jenga, like that block tower game that you play with children. And every one of the blocks in the game of Jenga is a bit of background knowledge or a vocabulary word. And then think of what happens, when you're playing that game. You can pull out a few blocks, a few bits of background knowledge, a few bits of vocabulary, and it stands up. But then what happens? You pull out one too many, and the entire thing collapses. They read it, but they don't get it. Before we run out of time, I want to make one last case for shared knowledge and vocabulary. And this has nothing to do with metacognition and language development or test scores. This is my answer to the familiar argument about social justice and equity. And the reasons that so many of us became school teachers in the first place. I want to take you back to January 20th, 2009. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Okay, so January 20th, 2009 was the day that Barack Obama took the oath of office as the 44th president of the United States. And on that day, there was a quote from a teacher in the Los Angeles Times, and it said this. It's an amazing event for our students, she said. They see Obama and they say, this is a president who looks like he can be president. Look, that is absolutely true and earnest and touching, deeply meaningful. I don't want to diminish in any way what that day meant to so many Americans, including, my students and their families. But I was troubled that day, and I'm still troubled today. The president's inaugural address in 2009 was rich in historical, literary, and biblical references that were almost certainly lost upon too many Americans and nearly all of our children. I'm going to play a minute of it for you.
A young nation, in the words of Scripture, the time has come to set aside childish things. The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness. In reaffirming the greatness of our nation, we understand that greatness is never a given. It must be earned. Our journey has never been one of shortcuts or settling for less. It has not been the path for the faint-hearted, for those who prefer leisure over work or seek only the pleasures of riches and fame. Rather, it has been the risk-takers, the doers, the makers of things, some celebrated, but more often men and women obscure in their labor, who have carried us up the long rugged path towards prosperity and freedom. For us, they packed up their few worldly possessions and traveled across oceans in search of a new life. For us, they toiled in sweatshops and settled the West, endured the lash of the whip, and plowed the hard earth. For us, they fought and died in places like Concord and Gettysburg, Normandy, and Quezon. Time and again, these men and women struggled and sacrificed and worked till their hands were raw so that we might live a better life. They saw America as bigger than the sum of our individual ambitions, greater than all the differences of birth or wealth or faction. This is the journey we continue today.
Okay, now consider what you just heard and what you just saw. Think about the amount of background knowledge that is required to fully, viscerally understand what Obama was talking about in his inaugural address. To have endured an education where history was a second-tier subject, where shared knowledge didn't matter, we'd be left to wonder. Advance the screen if I can.
We remain a young nation.
Well, I can't advance the screen. But you would be left to wonder, who were these people who toiled for us in sweatshops and settled the West? Who were these people who endured the lash of the whip and plowed the hard earth? If you don't know America's rich history, then Obama's description of those who, quote, packed up their few worldly possessions and traveled across oceans in search of a new life almost certainly failed to move you, to resonate with you. If you can't find on a map Concord, Gettysburg, Normandy, Quezon, if you don't know what happened in those places, then the sacrifices of those who, quote, fought and died for us in those places is lost upon you. If our children are ignorant of those pieces of their history, then at least some measure of that sacrifice was, alas, in vain. So look, it saddens me, and I think it ought to sadden all of us to think that two very different groups of Americans watched the inaugural address on January 20th, 2009. One group understood the deep historical significance, not just of the moment, but of the words, of all of the words. They knew the references, they knew the allusions, they grasped fully the moment in history to which they were bearing witnesses. A second group, including most of our children, all of my students, saw what? Novelty. To them, it was elsewhere in his speech, Obama talked about the rights of man, our common defense, American ideals that light the world. He praised the generation that faced down communism and fascism. We are the keepers of this legacy, he said. He spoke of the price and promise of citizenship. We have, he said, quote, duties to ourselves, our nation, and the world. Duties that, quote, we do not grudgingly accept, but rather seize gladly. Well, is that true? Are we the keepers of this legacy? Are we really? If the price and promise, and I'll conclude with this, if the price and promise of citizenship is lost upon our children, if they're ignorant of our civic ideals, how could they possibly appreciate the significance of that moment in history? You know, I think again of my former students in the South Bronx, could they even begin to grasp what this president who looks like them is asking of them? You know, again, lastly, think of the extraordinary and probable closing of a historical event that we witnessed on January 20th, 2009. So an African-American man takes the oath of office of our highest office. When he does so, his hand was on a Bible. It was Lincoln's Bible, the man who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Obama then turns to deliver his inaugural address. And when he turns, he's directly facing the site where Martin Luther King dreamed out loud of the day when his children would be judged, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And then he delivers an inaugural address to millions of Americans who had rendered precisely that judgment. You know, what a teachable moment, right? Not for our children, but for us who are either teachers or oversee public education. If we don't share that same history, if we don't share the same allusions and references, the events and ideals and words that have shaped us as a nation, we quite literally cannot understand each other. We see dimly, we understand superficially. So, you know, and I'll conclude with this. Why does knowledge matter? Well, that's the best case I can offer, the best example, the best argument I can make. It's to ensure that that doesn't happen. It's to ensure that in the very near future, our nation's children are able to judge each other not by the color of their skin or even the content of their character, but by the full weight of each other's words. Thank you very much for your attention. And Cory and Eric, if you're still there, I know we are going to go to questions. I don't know how to stop sharing my screen. I don't know if you have a tool that will take this down. But
I'll leave that to Eric if he's able to.
I'll see what I can figure out here.
Okay.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Oh, we just got one. Let's see here.
I can stop.
All right. Robert, are you ready for the first one?
I am, and I guess I should stop trying to to close the presentation. It's my screen seems to be stuck.
President Obama is stuck on our screen momentarily. Okay. All right. So you talked about how content is good for students. Can you also make the case that it is better for teachers if school boards pick a background knowledge curricula over basal? And just for context, I'll add here, as the questioner did, Wisconsin will only subsidize from our curriculum list, which are all excellent on background knowledge, EL, core knowledge, bookworms, wit and wisdom. But districts can pick what they want beyond that if they pay for it themselves. So as a result, districts are picking other curricula, usually from the big companies, usually basals, and working low in background knowledge. So any insight you can share in that regard?
Yeah, this is a really long, I could do a whole other hour on curriculum, but let me try to make it as quick and painless as possible. One of the reasons I became a curriculum advocate back in the day is because I was sort of shocked that when I became a teacher, I didn't have a curriculum. I remember my staff developer from Teachers College, when I asked in my naivete, hey, what am I supposed to teach? Where's my curriculum? Said to me in this rather unctuous, treacly way, well, Mr. Pondiscio, you're the best person to know what your children need. And I thought she was making fun of me. I swear, I thought this was like a little teacher hazing ritual. What she meant was that, hey, reading is a skill. it doesn't matter what the kids are reading. You should find things they're interested in, and practice strategies that I just spent the last hour, mocking. Curriculum is the gift that keeps on giving. One, I have no business then or now deciding what fifth graders in the South Bronx need to know in their education. Two, there's copious data. I'm thinking of a RAND study that shows virtually every teacher in America, I'm not kidding, like 98, 99%, uses material either all or in part that they either create, customize, or find themselves. So I spent an ungodly amount of time as a new teacher scouring the internet for lesson plans, trying to crack the code on what was going to engage my students. And maybe that was time well spent, but it was time that was not spent studying student work, giving feedback, developing a relationship with students and families. So even if a teacher is creating the greatest lesson since sliced bread with raisins, all those other things are more important. So yes, I have strong opinions about good, better, best in terms of curriculum, but the ones that the questioner listed, core knowledge, bookworms, wit and wisdom, EL. Back in the day, I founded an outfit called the Knowledge Matters campaign, and they do evaluations of curriculum. I don't want to suggest that one is as good as the other. However, the conceptual battle that needs to be won is there should be a curriculum, and my teachers should not be spending 20 or 30 hours a week creating lessons from scratch. Those other activities are more valuable. So, and that's a shift, frankly, in the culture of teaching. So one, get yourself a knowledge-rich curriculum. If you're going to ask me, I'm going to say pick CKLA because I was involved in the creation. I'm partial to it. But the larger battle it needs to get won is convincing teachers this is a high quality curriculum. We need to follow, not slavishly. Sure, you're always going to need to customize it somewhat, but not 20, 30 hours a week worth. Because the problem when you do that, when teachers are just saying, when teachers conceive of reading comprehension as just a skill, and it doesn't matter what they're reading as long as they're reading and enjoying it. Well, this is how, as I like to say, you end up learning the rainforest 4 times in the Bill of Rights never. Because the scope and sequence goes out the window, and we're just practicing this skill, which, as I hope I've just convinced you, is not a skill at all.
Thank you. And now these next 2 questions, they seem related to me, so I'm going to ask them together. It might be the same answer, it might be different, but here, are there any formal programs or methods that you value for building content in learners? And then on a related note, science of reading, do you have a curriculum for K through 3 that can be researched and purchased?
Yeah, I'm not here to hawk core knowledge. It's just the one that I'm most familiar with, having worked for the Core Knowledge Foundation and been involved in the creation of CKLA. So that's the one I'm partial to. But it's interesting. One of the reasons we created CKLA 10, 15 years ago, because there simply was no other ELA curriculum that was built with knowledge front and center. Now there are others, like I mentioned some of them: wit and wisdom, bookworms, EL, expeditionary learning, EL, etc. So I mean, I'm partial to the so-called skills strand of CKLA, but again, I'm not here to give a to market that program. I don't work for the foundation anymore. The key concept, however, a little bit of history. I mean, when E.D. Hirsch Jr., the founder of Core Knowledge, started, he wrote his first book, Cultural Literacy, about these ideas, about this idea that, look, language is a kind of is a collection of idioms and allusions and assumed knowledge. It was very controversial because it was widely perceived as, oh, Hirsch is trying to impose a dead white male canon on America's children, and we're a polyglot country. Well, the point that to keep in mind is, and I'm pretty sure I said this explicitly in my talk, it's not a canon making exercise. It's not learn this because I said so. It's a curatorial exercise. In other words, the way language works, whether it's in writing or in speech, is speakers and writers make assumptions about what listeners and readers know. And when those assumptions are correct, language proficiency works fluidly, effortlessly. When those assumptions are incorrect, comprehension, whether it's oral or written comprehension, falls down. So when you view it through that lens, you start to see, wait a minute, the goal here is not read this because I said so. It's not a canon. It's read this because people assume you will know this. So I always bring this up when people say, "Oh, we're going to decolonize the curriculum. Let's take away Greek mythology and whatnot because that's Eurocentric and it's white supremacist, whatever." Well, now put yourself in the situation of a kid who is a diligent student, does well in school, and then as an adult, whether it's a job interview or an opportunity for higher education, somebody makes reference to Pandora's box or Achilles heel, and the kid goes, "Huh, what's that?" Well, then the rest of the world is going to judge that kid harshly. "Oh, I thought that kid was smart, but can you believe he never heard Achilles heel?" So I don't like being the guy who says what kids should learn, but I do like being the guy who says, "Look, the world is going to judge children a lot more harshly than you and I will as teachers. So these are high stakes decisions. So you have to build a curriculum or perhaps purchase it in this instance with an eye towards what is the body of knowledge that people will assume children will have. And let me be also abundantly clear. There's not enough time in a school year, 180 days times 7 a day times 40 weeks a year to acquire all of it. So this is also a school culture issue. I always use the analogy, I don't think it's original to me, of windows versus mirrors. The way I was taught to teach reading is it's all about the mirror. That the kids have got to read things that are relevant to them, that reflect their experience. This is engaging for them. And a little bit of that goes a long way. My point is an entire school culture should be oriented towards the window, because there can never be enough time to know everything that's taken for granted. But you can have an education that valorizes being generally knowledgeable, being curious about the world, paying attention to the news, etc., so that you pick up a lot of the working knowledge that literate people assume you have.
Thank you. And I know we're at an hour here. I'm going to propose that we go 5 minutes past, if that works for you, Robert. And folks, if you have to leave and want to catch this on YouTube later, that is okay. But I'm going to suggest that we go a little bit past here. And I believe we have someone who wants to ask a live question. Eric, if you're able to do that on your end, please.
Yeah, Professor Schultz, go ahead.
Hi, Cory. Eric, Robert, thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to pick up a thought that you began to speak a bit more passionately about the farther you went along, though I really appreciate your debunking of current pablum in our education. So I should mention that I am actually a very grateful Will client because of, I suppose, reading a bit too much and writing a bit too much. I needed defense against the attack on my academic freedom at my university, Concordia University in Wisconsin. I am since moving from that, or rather, I would say the Lord is moving me from that, and I'm about to start teaching and serving as academic dean in the Lutheran School of Theology in Kenya. So I think that gives me an opportunity to pose this question, mostly because I'd really like to talk with you more. So maybe we can arrange that. But you accepted, I think very properly, the domain of the school, our traditional school, for your wonderful presentation on reading. But I'd like to propose that I think that the school is just entirely to an industrial constraint on the real teaching that you and I and any teacher worth his or her salt really want to teach to people. So just for an example, in the work in Kenya, we have a half study day and a half work day for our students. The only counterpart I'm aware of here in the States for that would be something like the College of the Ozarks near Branson, Missouri. I think that this is bringing us more and more into what I think you're arguing for, and that is conversation, isn't it? It's conversation, not school classes for 1 hour or for a few hours a day, but it's this ongoing conversation among us as human beings. So we know how it is just killing us not to be able to have conversations with our parents and our students and one another, frankly. I'm also thinking of the difficulty, to use that word industrial again, of trying to pack in what we know, that is, we who are called and brought into teaching, what we know we want to be doing. This is fully a total society thing, isn't it? Starts with the family. It depends on the parents. And I'd just like to give you a chance to start opening things up just a tad more there. Feel free to disagree with me if you like, but I think that the more we get to the natural, which is, the way things were situated originally, I think the better we'd be.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, the opportunity. My only semi-cogent response is to say, look, I'm an unapologetic school choice guy, even though I spent my entire hour talking about my experience in a traditional public school. One of the reasons that I'm a school choice fan is because I don't think that I don't tend to talk about industrial schooling, although I realize others do. I'm a practical man. In other words, despite the fact that I'm a fan of school choice and advocate for it, I also recognize that, look, traditional public schools are not going to go away. There are a lot smaller percentage of American kids in geographically zoned public schools today than ever before, and that number is probably only going to decline for lots of reasons. But we don't have the luxury of washing our hands of them. So I find myself, counseling my school choice advocate friends saying, look, yes, school choice is an intrinsic good, and it increases the likelihood of these kinds of outcomes, these kinds of conversations that the professor was alluding to. But I think as Americans and public policy people, we have an obligation not to forget that at least a significant plurality of our children, America's children, are in public schools and always will be. So yes, you can make the case that and I'm not an economist, that competitive effects will improve outcomes for those schools, and I'm sure that in some measure that's also true. But we also have to, if there's a theme to my work over the last 20 years, it's, look, we have to make teaching doable by the teachers we have, not the teachers we wish we had. We have to be clear-eyed about the conditions of those schools. We have to be clear-eyed about the fact that these will always be, if not the majority of children, then a strong plurality of children. So we simply have to do everything in our power to make them better. Make those schools more better teaching reading, make those teachers more sophisticated consumers of curriculum and pedagogy, et cetera. So none of this is to gainsay any of what you've said, but just as a practical matter, I'm unable to turn my back to, say, inner city public schools, because I just don't see them going away, certainly in my lifetime and probably in the lifetime of anybody within the sound of my voice.
Thank you. Thank you. And I know we have a few more questions in the chat. I think we're going to wrap up since we're a little bit over time. I'm really sorry that we weren't able to get to those. If we can, we'll perhaps work with Robert and see if we can get some sort of response out to you via email. He's nodding there. We'll get a response to you.
I was going to say, Cory, before my screen froze, the last slide that I had my number, my contact information, email address, and my Twitter handle. So when you post this online, would you please post that so people can get in touch with me?
Yes, we will post that. Everyone who attended today will also get an email from us. We'll include that information. We'll also include a link for you if you're interested in registering for our next presentation in this series with Ryan Petty on school safety on August 6th at 11 a.m. Central. Save that date. And before I conclude, I want to also make a plug. So Will is working on a series of reports with Robert for school board members in particular. We've published our first one. It is about schools and the First Amendment. That's through the American Enterprise Institute Conservative Education Reform Network. And we'll have more forthcoming. So we'll try to make those available to you all as well. But with that, again, feel free to reach out to us at any time. We'll include Robert's contact info and where you can follow him and see his work. And just thank you, Robert. We're really grateful to have you join us today for that fantastic presentation. And thank you all for joining us as well.
Thanks, Cory. Thanks, Will.